1958 marked the beginning of an idea to bring about how one views and understands management and its potential for meaningful interaction. This led to the birth of Calcutta Management Association or CMA, with Sir Jahangir Gandhi, the then Director General of Tata Iron and Steel Company Limited, as the founder president. CMA today is a vibrant organization, as vibrant as the city it is located in. Affiliated to All India Management Association or IMA, the apex management body in the country, CMA today has a membership base of over 1,000, including nearly 100 corporates. True to its mission and vision to create a platform for the management community where contemporary management ideas can be conceptualized, formulated, developed and practiced, CMA over the years has organized a series of path-breaking meets, workshops, seminars, talks, interactive sessions and exchange programs. We at CMA have taken on the onus of covering a wide area from management education to management practice, with the objective of fostering and developing excellence in management, all to help profit the mind.
Hello and good evening, Dr. Subramanian. Good evening, Mr. Neotia. A quick check. Can you hear me well?
Yes, I can at least.
Okay. Yeah. Good evening from the Calcutta Management Association to all our viewers and listeners in here. We're in for another exciting session of leadership in turbulent times. And they say that always make good use of a crisis. And what better timing than to have Dr. Subramanian with us to deliver about 45 minutes of his thought of what he feels about the India in turbulent times and how we feel that we need to go ahead. But just to give a context to all of the listeners in here, in the Leadership in Turbulence series, we had luminaries like Mr. Gopal Krishnan, Mr. Neotia himself, Mohandas Pai, Mr. Munjal, Arvind Panagaria the last week, Sanjeev Mehta from HUL, and we always had wonderful sessions post listening to them. And today we have Dr. K.V. Subramanian, who will be taking us through the next 45 minutes or so. The session is about an hour's duration, in which we'll have around 30 to 40 minutes listening from Dr. Subramanian, and then any other questions which you all have, my request would be to please keep it in the chat box, and we plan to take it once his session is done. But before that, I think it's my duty to also welcome and introduce Mr. Neotia, a legend by himself. And for all of those who know Mr. Neotia, a Padma Shri awardee, a real estate entrepreneur, a connoisseur of art, craft, and other creative inputs, Mr. Neotia juggles many hats with equal elan. As chairman of Ambuja Neotia Group, he operates across the spectrum of the real estate industry, gifting Kolkata and Eastern India with landmark properties, ranging from residential to retail, from hospitals to hotels, from educational institutes to smart workplaces. A pioneer in the Indian social housing society, a sector, Mr. Neotia has been conferred with the Padma Shri by the Honorable President of India in 1999. Mr. Neotia's other associations also include being a past president of FICCI and IMA. He's also a member of several distinguished institutions like Brand Eater Equity Foundation Trust, established by the Department of Commerce, Ministry of Commerce and Industry, Government of India, the Governing Council of the Indian Design Council, and the Board of Trustees for Indira Gandhi National Center for Arts, New Delhi. He's also the chairman of National Institute of Technical Teachers Training and Research Institute in Kolkata. He heads Jnana Pravaha, a Center for Cultural Studies and Research in Varanasi, as its chairman, and also serves as Honorary Consul of Israel in West Bengal. Mr. Neotia, welcome again, and over to you for taking the session forward with Dr. Subramanian. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Shenoy. Namaskar to all fellow panelists, and a very, very warm welcome to Dr. Krishnamurthy Subramanian. Very warm welcome, sir. It's my great privilege and honor to be speaking to you again in this lockdown period, rather not really lockdown anymore, but in the post-COVID time. Now, just briefly, I know that Mr. Krishnamurthy is much written about, and he also speaks very often on television, so you all know him. But since it's a management association, it would be only appropriate for me to just spend 1 minute in a brief introduction. Mr. Subramanian, Dr. Subramanian, actually did his IIT electrical engineering from IIT Kanpur, went on to do his management education at IIM Kolkata, which is brings him to a connection with our city, and then went on to do his PhD from Chicago. He has been a professor of finance at the ISB till he was taken up the job of the chief economic advisor to the government of India. Now, I think it is with his kind of credentials and academic background, I don't think we could have had a more capable person to navigate the country in probably the biggest financial crisis that this country has seen, at least for everyone that is on the panel in our generation. Maybe before that, maybe 50 years before, there might have been other challenges, but I don't think ever since we got independence, we have been besetted with so many issues on the economic front, and not to talk about the COVID issues as separate from the economic ones, because there is a quasi-medical issue there. So with this kind of a perfect storm, if I may use the word, we were having a slowdown in the economy. Our GDP growth was somewhat tepid even prior to COVID, and now it has had this very devastating blow because of the aftermath of COVID. We are obviously seeing some very, very promising signs of recovery, but as we all know, this is going to be a little bit of a slow trudge. So with that little introduction and opening comments, I would like to request Dr. Subramanian to first share his thoughts, maybe 15, 20 minutes, 25 minutes, whatever he wants to take. And then we will have some conversation with him. So over to you, sir. Very warm welcome once again.
Very good evening, and thank you very much for those kind words. First, I think without further ado, let me get on right away with clarifying something that Harshji mentioned. As you would have seen in media interactions and my pieces, I speak based on data, and I'm not inclined to just give opinion. In that, let me clarify that the decline now is because of the COVID crisis. Number one. Second, I think it would be incorrect to associate GDP decline, the decline in Q1 with anything that was happening before the crisis. I've written a piece in the Indian Express where I have clarified using careful data 60 indicators, to be precise, about 58 high frequency indicators on a weekly basis, and the view of the economy therefore is based on these high frequency indicators. First, let me clarify that yes, there was GDP growth had been slowed down, but important to keep in mind that in the month of February, if you look at all the high frequency indicators, the purchasing index for manufacturing and services, cement production, steel production, freight, exports, power consumption, all these in the month of February were highest in the previous 7 months. So they were all in positive territory, which had not happened since the month of July. bring this up is that COVID hit India in the month of March. And March, as you all know, is the most important month in the financial year because a lot of activity happens in that. So to take that 3.1% growth that we registered in Q4, thereby to say that we actually had a declining pattern of growth, the decline had to do, of course, with the economy. But this particular performance in Q4 and later in Q1 does not have to do with the fundamentals of the economy. It actually has to do with the COVID pandemic, the need for the lockdown and the social distancing. So I would want to open the hood on that 3.1% because if you look at the Google mobility data, the Google mobility data clearly showed that in the mobility was down by 20% compared to January and February. Now, some of you may say we have lockdown only starting from the how can one attribute then the decline to COVID? Actually pointing out the mobility that because of the fear of COVID, mobility started declining in the month of March itself, and so and that had an impact on economic because of the fear and the social distancing, and which impacts the service sector significantly. So now, while this is of course always a matter of estimation, but I have absolutely no doubt in saying that if, for instance, experiment, if COVID had hit India, let's say in the month of April or May, and you would not have had Q4 being affected by COVID, then I am absolutely confident that we would have reversed the trend of decline in GDP growth. The growth would have been far higher than the than the growth that we in Q3. I think this is fine because otherwise one tends to associate two things that have absolutely nothing to do with the association. One thing I will definitely mention though is that the financial sector, the fact that there was actually credit slowing down because of supply side reasons, that's something that has been happening pre-COVID, and actually that is something which you can post-COVID also you can associate with the pre-COVID. That is a legitimate aspect, but overall macro economy to actually associate what was happening COVID, which a lot of companies are doing without actually picking up the hood and looking under the hood, for instance, and saying that was the 3.1% indeed fully because of the economy, or was it because of the exogenous shock that COVID has created? I think that question is very important. Policy making is about understanding causality and not just looking at raw numbers, but understanding what caused. And that's why this particular observation and this clarity is extremely important, which is to say that the policy actions that were being taken in the month of July, I would especially mention, for instance, the CMA had actually come close to 58, which close to 60% of the purchasing managers in the service sector in the month of February. I'm talking about in the month of February, were anticipating expansion, and service sector accounting for almost 60% of the value add in the economy. That actually meant that the policies that we were implementing till then were indeed having their impact. I think this is the first point that I want to make. Second, I think this is again where I must clarify. I don't think that what I'm going to say here is necessarily in disagreement with what she mentioned, but the crisis that we've had on the financial side is clearly because of the pandemic, and there is no question that that this is unprecedented. Just to give you one example, the World Economic Outlook has mentioned that if you look at the percentage of countries where there is going to be a decline in the GDP per capita this year because of the pandemic, is going to be the highest in 150 years. So not 50 years, but in terms of the exogenous shock, this is something that maybe even our grandfathers might not have actually lived through. So this is, so in the pandemic, the only pandemic that rivals this is the Spanish flu episode of 1918. So that's 102 years back. So that's the second point to remember. In that context, I must also mention that the policy government has been driven following consideration, which is that while will come back, and indeed it is, as Hershey also mentioned, if you look at the indicators, it is indeed coming back, but human lives that are lost cannot be brought back. I think this fundamental aspect is something that we have to look at, and not just from a from the health and the life perspective, but even from economic perspective. And allow me to explain why this is important. The first thing to recognize in India is that an average household where the bread earner typically supports 4 other people. In other words, the average family in India comprises about 5 people. So where the bread earner supports 4 other people. Now, given this particular fact, let's think through what would have happened if we did not have an intense lockdown. India, firstly, the population is almost 140 crores, 135 crores, and a pandemic spreads based on network effects. Network effects, the way they affect the digital economy, for instance, to put it very simply, the pace of spread in a population of 100 people versus a population of 1,000 people will not be the same, because it grows exponentially. And so the size of the population is something that really affects the pace of the pandemic. Second, not only the size of the population, but also the density itself, which is very high in India, also adds to this. So it's if, for instance, we did not have the lockdown, and the several epidemiologists have researched not parameter, which is what captures how many people is one infected person likely to infect. For COVID pandemic, it's about 2.3 to 2.4, absent any intervention. Common flu, for instance, is about 1.3, 1.4. The Ebola pandemic, Ebola, for instance, has smallpox, R0 is about 3.5, 3.4. So far more, in terms of the spread. So with a R0 about 2.3, 2.4, if lockdown was not as intense, we would have easily been looking at 50, 60,000 cases in the second half of April, 60,000 cases in the month of, a day. And now let's put one important fact, if you look at the mortality rates in the April vis-a-vis what we are having now, the mortality rates in the month of April were about 4.3, 4.4%. In contrast, now the mortality rates are about 1.3, 1.4%. Why is that the case? One, the doctors have actually learned how to treat it. They've gone up the learning curve, and the health infrastructure and testing infrastructure has been ramped up. If, for instance, what a lockdown provided, and this is something that epidemiologists made it very clear, what a lockdown does is it pushes the curve, it gives you time, it buys you time, so that you can actually ramp up the infrastructure, both the testing infrastructure and the health infrastructure. Testing infrastructure enables you to test and thereby quarantine. If we did not have that time to ramp up this infrastructure, it is easy, I think one can easily clearly see that the mortality rate should have been higher than 4.5%, 5%. You take the numbers, 50, 60,000 cases, in every day in the month of second half of April, mortality rate is about 5%, 6%. You do the numbers, we would have been looking at 3,000 to 4,000 deaths a day. That's the number of deaths we would have been looking at if we did not have the lockdown. I think this is really important to keep in mind. Why is this important in Indian context? Because when you have a population where each family, the bread earner supports 4 other people, Of course, because of the lockdown and the impact on the economy, such families have been affected. No doubt about it. But if suppose that breadwinner who is the most vulnerable to the pandemic because he has to go and work and get, if he dies, 4 other people become destitute. So the destitution that would have happened, with less intense in a country like India would have been far, far worse. And this is reflected in the data. If you look at the number of deaths per lakh, the number of deaths in India is actually almost 1/10 to 1/12 of the numbers in countries like US, Brazil, etc. By the way, those who actually are cynical, who may say that that data can be actually changed in democracy, deaths is something that you cannot actually. That is something that you cannot change. It is, and you can see, for instance, even look at various across states. Those states that were supposedly doing well in early on, Kerala model, for instance, now you see they're actually doing as. What that tells you is that the data, if someone could work with the data, quote unquote, the data, they would have been able to do that across time. So I think we must be taking those numbers on deaths definitely at face value. The actual cases depend on the nature of test, the antigen test or the other test you do, because there are possible false negatives and that. But deaths is a number not actually play around with. So the proof of the pudding actually lies in the mortality rates that we have. So that's the most important point to remember. So, in March, faced with the pandemic, policymakers had the choice between choosing between a worse outcome and an outcome actually that would be better and worse, and that is what we chose, basically what was better than worse, and that's the important thing to remember. And faced a lot of uncertainty, one had to actually make that choice to focus on lives, because once lives are lost, you cannot get them back. But GDP growth, you can get them back, and we are indeed getting them back, in fact. And that's the second part that I want to now focus on, which is, if you look at again many of the indicators, the manufacturing PMI, for instance, is at a 7-year high. We look at the service PMI, it's 49.8. So sector clearly is not doing as well as the manufacturing sector, and that is expected because the need for social distancing in sectors and the impact of that on sectors like travel, tourism, hotels, etc., is clearly more that in the manufacturing sector. So a two-phased recovery, with manufacturing recovering much faster than services because of the impact of the social distancing. And by the way, we are not in the post-COVID era yet. We are in the lockdown era. We are in the unlocked phase. The post-COVID era will when we have the vaccine, and that's where the government is in fact pouring a lot of resources to ensure vaccines are delivered as early as possible, so that all of us can resume our normal lives without the masks, without the need for distancing, at the earliest. And that will happen when the vaccine is there, and large get inoculated. Now, let me say a few more things on the recovery itself. If you look at the high frequency indicators, again the same kind of indicators. If you compare pre-COVID, which is February or March, early March, not the latter half, maybe first week, or even on a Y-on-Y basis, in manufacturing, clearly there's been a robust recovery. Services, though, it's not back to the pre-COVID levels or the Y-on-Y levels. Is down compared to pre-COVID or and that is, as I said, of social distancing. Now, let me focus on what is, what has been the economic strategy, apart from the health strategy, on ensuring that lives are saved. The Indian government been the only one that has launched a series of seminal reforms, as part of the Atmanirbhar Bharat package. I'm sure all of you as industrialists would have seen labor reforms. Labor reforms, by the way, have been talked about since in school. Labor reform, the conditionality that the IMF loan, gave in 1991. In other words, for the last 29 years, been talked about, and yet they've not happened. But for the first time now they've happened. Some of the key aspects are that 44 laws across the that were contract, they've now been subsumed into 4 codes, which basically does make compliance much better. The second key aspect, and details. So in the interest of time, I'm not going to go into the granular details, but on the big picture. So that's first thing, that compliance, because many definitions like salary, wages, bonus, price, etc., were defined differently across of those 44 acts, which made compliance actually a nightmare. Now only 4 codes is something that is enabled. The second key change is the enabling full-time equivalent, which is that you can actually have contractual work, and thereby tailor employment to the demand conditions, and that is something which will help both the both employer and the employee as well, because now without the constraint of not being able to tailor to demand, the employers can hire employees, and thereby employment should increase as well. Second key change. The third is replicating what happened in Rajasthan, which is the standing orders. In Rajasthan, it was changed. The threshold was changed from 100 employees to 300 employees. The same thing has been at the central level as well. And in the economic survey, July, it shown how the Rajasthan change led to increase in in firm sizes and increased employment as well. So we can anticipate the same thing. Earlier, what was happening was that a lot of firms chose to be less than 100 employees so that they can escape the standing order clause. Now those firms can certainly go at least till 290, 295 employees. That can mean almost a 3 times increase in employment, especially for many of these smaller firms. So, and that's something that happened in Rajasthan, possible, and will definitely happen. I confident of in the using the central laws. So labor laws important, and actually something that will help productivity and growth in the manufacturing sector. The second is the farm bill agriculture reforms, and I'm sure all of you have read those reforms. I've written a piece in the Times of India, commending those reforms because they give market opportunities to the small farmers that was non-existent till now. Every other producer in this country had the freedom to go and sell where he wanted, except the farmer, and especially the small farmer. The change in the Commodities Act also actually enabled storage and help the food processing sector. So that's an important reform. The privatization agenda that has been announced, I think, is very important. It recognizes that efficiency is enabled in the private sector. In a country where the golden, or the commanding heights of the economy was given to the public sector in the first industrial policy of the 1950s, and in a country where, despite 30 years of liberalization, the word privatization was never used before. Disinvestment was the word that was employed. I think in that country, for us to actually state that, except for a few strategic sectors, private sector will actually be, companies will, the state will get out of business in all non-strategic sectors, and that even in the strategic sectors, the number of state-owned enterprises will be restricted to 4, maximum 4. I think is a very important change in the statement of intent, and it's a real So overall, when you combine that and with the change in MSME definitions, the export PLI scheme, which is actually showing encouraging results, and finally the emphasis on Atmanirbhar Bharat. I think from an economic perspective, it is very important, and I want to actually spend some time giving color to what is really the Atmanirbhar Bharat push about. If we look at the Indian economy and compare it to some of the other economies, one of our key strength is the fact that we have a large population, and if we look since 1991 itself, as a result of economic growth, a large section of the population that would have been part of the poor have come into the middle class over the last 30 years because of economic growth. And that has helped increase the purchasing power, because as people come into the middle class, they actually have greater purchasing power, and people have been lifted from poverty. So the Atmanirbhar Bharat initiative recognizes that in one of India's key strengths is that we have a potentially very, very large domestic market. But so far, our companies have not, really focused as much on utilizing that. And, I say this as a business school professor. If you look at the models that have been adopted by most companies, they have been margin-driven models, actually focused on the top 25-30% of the income pyramid. Delivering products and services to the top 25-30% of the, in terms of the income pyramid. So they're relatively rich, and that's where the margins are greater, which is of course something that is important and is required. But for a country like India with a population of 135 crores, there is also a huge space for a volume-driven model to cater to products and create products and services at the bottom of the pyramid. I'll give you two examples. One that I was personally involved in, and something that I actually enjoyed incredibly, to Bandhan Bank, which is actually, it's a model of microfinance, which is taking business to the bottom of the pyramid, tailoring a loan that can actually be delivered at the bottom of the pyramid, rather than just focusing on the 25-30% of the income pyramid. So that's one model. It's a volume-driven model, not a margin-driven model. Similarly, if you look at the FMCG sector in India, India and East Asia and Southeast Asia in particular is one geography where you can go to any remote area, and if you want to get Dove shampoo, you can get it in those shampoo sachets. The highest product or the best product, Dove, or for that Navratan oil, for instance, or toothpaste, you can avail that in those shampoo sachets. These are products, again, volume driven at the bottom of the pyramid. Now, these are two examples of what can be driven, what can be, evolved at. Our entrepreneurs are actually second to none in their creativity. Now, if our entrepreneurs actually put their minds together and say that, we've been focusing so far on creating products and services for the top 25-30% of the income pyramid, but we can create products for the bottom of the pyramid as well, and thereby actually tap into the enormous purchasing power that exists. That would be something that will enable our, and will really tap into the strength. That is the basic idea. And let me also mention that Atmanirbhar, as you all know, in Hindi means self-reliance. And there is that self-reliance is different from self-sufficiency. Self-sufficiency is actually is isolation, has an element of isolation in it. But self-reliance is not something that can actually be gained through isolation. Self-reliance can only be gained by being able to actually compete with the best, because self-reliance cannot come without capabilities. And you can look around among your own at the individual level as well. Somebody who's not capable cannot be self-reliant. The same is true for companies, and it's true for countries as well. So self-reliance actually can come only by building capabilities. And that is where the focus on exports is also as critical. So while we are focusing on tapping into the strength, which is the domestic demand, but we think about the external sector as a complement to that, not a substitute, because by competing with the best, and that is how, and creating products that actually sell in world markets, our companies can also then tailor products for the domestic economy as well. So that is very important to understand, that Atmanirbharta is not about isolation and therefore about self-sufficiency. It is about self-reliance, and therefore growing capabilities by enabling competition and being able to sort of compete with the best. And in this context, I would also say that capabilities are not built by being protectionist. Capabilities are built only by competing with the best. But when a company is, or an industry is in its infancy, some amount of actually protection, the way a parent protects the kid while the kid grows up and becomes an adult, is something that is actually, it's paternal, and it's something that is required. You do not basically let a kid go and compete with an adult. But if there is an adult, you very well ask that adult to go and compete with other adults. And that's the spirit in which actually this. So the Atmanirbhar Bharat push is not about protectionism. We are very clear about that. It is about enabling some of our sectors that actually need to grow from infants to be able to be adults in the world market. That little bit of and therefore some of the measures therefore are only tailored towards making them capable and giving them that necessary support when they need to be able to compete with the best. So I think to summarize in terms of the overall focus going forward, I think what we've done is, through these reforms, we've really enabled productive capacity and increase in productivity in the economy, which is something that will really enable in the medium to long term. And the emphasis on Atmanirbhar package will also enable, by the way, foreign savings to come in. For instance, if you look at the macro data, Q1, we had a current account surplus of $19.8 billion, which is about 0.71% of the yearly GDP. And if even Q2 to Q4, we have half of that performance, about 0.35% of GDP current account surplus, we can be looking at about 1.75%. A current account surplus for the full year, which thereby also provides fiscal space, because one of the identities in macroeconomics is that public savings plus private savings is equal to the current account balance. And so foreign savings in this case are therefore providing us the opportunity to be able to providing fiscal space, and which is something which we are looking to utilize in the short run, because the reforms have really taken care of the medium to long term. We now have to just focus on creating that short-term bridge so that we can go and really utilize the benefit of these reforms with minimum damage to our product capacity, during this time, by focusing on demand. And so that's sort of the broad vision that is being focused on. I'll end with just giving a thematic ribbon to these reforms. If you look at the Indian economy, as I said earlier as well, it's a service sector that was primarily dominant. If you split it into primary, secondary and tertiary, services comes in the tertiary sector. So tertiary sector was dominant, has been dominant, and that is something which is very good. But we also need, given our large population and the youth that actually need jobs, the primary and the secondary sectors are also as important, because they have the potential to create jobs for the large number of youth. And that is why, if you look at the reforms, they are focused on enabling the primary sector through the agriculture reforms, and enabling the manufacturing sector, which is the secondary sector. And that's one of the key focus, to basically enable a lot more job creation, because that will then put money in the hands of people and enable demand to go up in the economy. I'm talking about in the medium to long term. Of course, in the short run, given the uncertainty, there is demand is is tepid at this point in time, though it's coming back in the manufacturing sector. But going forward, this emphasis on the primary and the secondary sectors will enable significant job creation and thereby bring demand to the. That's one key thematic ribbon that ties these reforms. The second important, thematic ribbon is the emphasis on markets and on, the invisible hand of the market tied with the hand of trust, focusing on transparency and for ethical wealth creation. I think, while people talk about wealth creation, the emphasis that I would place on is ethical wealth creation, not just wealth creation by any means, ethical wealth creation. And this, if you go and read the literature, India, being a very, very old civilization, there's been a lot written even on economic matters 2000 years back and even longer. So for instance, if as disparate literature as the Arthashastra, which has been primarily influential in the north, and Tirukkural, for instance, is something that as a Tamilian I have been exposed to. If you go and read there, you would find actually ethical wealth creation through the marriage of the invisible hand of the market, that's trade primarily and markets, with the hand of trust, and which itself, appealed, and which was through the spiritual traditions of the country. Marriage of that is what delivered prosperity for India. And and this is research that shows. Angus Madison's research, he basically went and looked at the GDP over the last 2000 years. If you look at that, for 3/4 of known economic history, India had the pole position in the economy, because India accounted for more than 1/3 of global GDP for 3/4 of economic history. And such kind of dominance does not happen through accident. Such kind of dominance happens through design. And that design was one of ethical wealth creation by enabling markets, the invisible hand of markets, with the hand of trust, transparency, and ethical wealth creation. So that is something that I would want to emphasize. So these reforms and the emphasis on Atmanirbhar, is actually articulating and manifesting this vision of ethical wealth creation, which is what enabled India to occupy the pole position, in the past. And by following these timeless principles, I think the evidence of reforms and liberalization since 1991 done by governments across the political spectrum, I think illustrate that these timeless principles indeed work and they do create prosperity. So we should basically be focusing on ethical wealth creation by enabling markets and by enabling more transparency and trust. That's the vision that actually carries that is reflected in these reforms. So I'll stop here by saying that going forward, the Indian economy's future is definitely very good. The only part I would say is that the short-term bridge we need to focus on, because the medium to long term we're really enabled by articulating this vision and implementing it. Thank you very much, and thanks a lot for your kind attention.
Thank you very much. That was a very, very comprehensive address. I must also add that clearly in the last 6 months, the number of key initiatives taken by the government, particularly in reforms that you have alluded to, are absolutely path-breaking. And it is probably not visible yet because we have the shadow of COVID over us, and also many of these things take time for its benefits to be available. But I have no measure of doubt that over the next couple of years, we will see remarkable results coming through because of the reforms that we have in various sectors that include farm, labor, disinvestment, MSME, etc. Sir, I would like to just mention, you have also alluded that one of the sectors that have been very badly impacted is the services sector, and that too the contact sector, the contact business sector, like aviation, tourism, hospitality. Is there a possibility, and since Finance Minister in one of her talks recently had alluded to a possibility of some more support coming through maybe later this year. Is there a possibility of encouraging Indians to probably travel within India, to give some kind of governmental support to this idea and a push so that the sector which is so badly impacted gets some fillip? I'm aware that it is not probably possible to give cash handouts or any such benefits, but is there a possibility to give some incentives to encourage domestic tourism, to support the hospitality industry and the aviation industry?
Thanks a lot, Harshit. Let me just add to the excellent point that you made, just by giving some more evidence. That's sort of what we economists do. If you look at the 1991 reforms, after the reforms were done, it took a year or two for the effects to manifest. Similarly, if you look at the at what happened after the Asian financial crisis. And this is, by the way, something that I always mention when people talk about saying, oh, the fact that for 8 quarters our GDP was declining means our potential growth is impacted. I do not agree with that, because if you remember, those of you who actually follow the economy, have followed the economy over a longer period of time, would remember that in 3 years, that is 12 quarters, in 2000 the growth rate was 3.8%. 2001 the growth rate was 4.8%, and 2002 the growth rate was 3.8%. So in other words, for 12 quarters, for 3 years, the growth rate was hovering around 4%, lower than what we had during these 8 quarters. And and this happened because of an exogenous shock. Some of the reforms that had been taken in 1991, their momentum had sort of had slowed down, and that, together with the Asian financial crisis that happened, an exogenous shock slowed down the economy. Now, what did the government do at that time? It did reforms, did a lot of disinvestment, enabled private sector, and secondly, structural reforms. For instance, just to give one example, the small-scale reservations that used to be there, those were removed at that point in time. So there were reforms that were done together with a big infrastructure push. The Golden Quadrilateral, for instance, was built at that time. The Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan was started at that time. So these together, actually, the fiscal push together with reforms is what brought growth back. And growth, how? From 2003 onwards till the global financial crisis hit, we were actually clocking 8% plus consistently. And of course, the global economy again, supported that. But the point I'm trying to make here is that you find a lot of analysts saying, oh, because there's been a slowdown in the last 8 quarters, had been before the COVID, that this basically means our potential growth rate should be marked down for India. I think that oftentimes there's a lot of saliency bias, something that behavioral economists actually call, which is just putting a lot more evidence on recent data and not taking into account some of the fundamentals in such an exercise. So I think I just wanted to point out that even in that time, reforms took a little bit of time for the effect to come. Growth, basically reforms were done around 2001, and in fact, good part of the growth that happened after that was because of these reforms. So I have no doubt, therefore, just inferring from history, that we will again have that from these reforms as well.
That's certainly encouraging. But sir, please, I request some light on the whether there's a possibility of getting some support for the contact business sector.
So Harshit, let me respond with 2 points here. First, that as I already said, it's my opinion, looking at the data, the fact that we are this year looking at a current account surplus. So there is basically now some fiscal room that has come in. But from the perspective of maximizing the bang for the buck, I actually believe it is really important to increase aggregate demand in the economy. because aggregate demand, and when I say aggregate demand, I'm talking about across all sectors, aggregated across all of them. That is where the maximum bang for the buck is, because without aggregate demand, and you understand this far better than I do, you would basically not invest as much if you're not sure about aggregate demand. And if you basically, if banks may not give that much credit, or firms themselves may not go and ask for credit if they don't see as much aggregate demand. So overall, if you look at the most important aspect now is to focus on aggregate demand. And where is that going to come from? You already mentioned about cash transfers. If you think about why is aggregate demand down in times like these, it is because of the uncertainty and the precautionary motive to save that it creates. So for instance, if you look at the data, the PMJDY balances, the Pradhan Mantri Jan Dhan Yojana balances, they increased by almost 20,000 crores during the period of the lockdown. So, and there are about 40 crore accounts, PMJDY accounts. So on average, the balance increase was 500 rupees. And now we all will acknowledge that these are accounts at the bottom of the pyramid, which typically, whatever income, if they get 100 rupees additional income, they typically go and spend that entire 100 rupees. But if this section of the population itself was saving, I think that clearly illustrates the precautionary motive to save, because all of them thinking that I may need, if I actually become sick because of COVID, or some family member becomes sick because of COVID, I may need this for healthcare expenditures, and that is why people are saving. Middle class also, if you look at the deposits in the bank deposits, they've also increased. The reason I'm saying this is that just giving cash, for instance, is not going to bring back aggregate demand. What people need is this assurance that for maybe next some period of time, their income will actually not be impacted. That's when they will go and and spend, and that will bring back aggregate demand. So the focus has to be therefore on ways in which the income can actually be sustained, and thereby aggregate demand can be brought in. So the response to you is that rather than focusing on sectors which actually I'm empathetic to what you're saying, but one of the key aspects of policy making is to ensure that the taxpayer rupee is actually, the impact of that is maximized. So the fiscal space that we are getting, we need to ensure that that is spent in a way that really brings back aggregate demand, because the positive spillover effects that it will have on investment, that it will have on on other consumption as well, and on and on the banking sector itself, NPAs, etc., will be very, very salutary. That is why the focus has to be there.
Thank you very much, sir. I will hand over to Mr. Shenoy, because I think there are some questions in the chat box.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Neotia. And Dr. Subramanian, thank you very much for an exciting session. And I must confess, it's like drinking off a fire hose, in full blast. So it's been real tough to keep a track of the number of questions flowing in. I think there are plenty of questions which are coming thick and fast. If you could give me permission, then maybe I could pick up 4 or 5 of them, and I hope it's okay with you. And
Sure.
Maybe we can have a quick thoughts of yours as well. And I go with the first question, which comes from Vaibhav Bhartiya. And he says, an eminent economist on a webinar says this, and he's talking about the farm bill. It may not be successful because of the lack of infrastructure to attract private players from reaching to farmers and vice versa. And there I'm connecting it to the tweet which you did, Dr. Subramanian, when you mentioned that the current reforms make a welcome departure from where political words and political deeds are not dissonant for the farmers. How would you like to read the lines between the farm bill and the question which Vaibhav Bharti has asked?
So, Mr. Shenoy, that tweet was based on the article, which I would encourage you to read, because the article, has the economic logic for why I said what I said. And the detailed answer to this question is also there in that article. I'll keep it short here and encourage the person who's asked that question to go and read that article. If you look at the data, small farmer, when and this is a study that was done by professors at IIM Ahmedabad, they looked at what is the share of the of the surplus. So when a buyer and a seller come together, you all know this, there is value added that is created, value added or surplus. The small farmer, so far has gotten about 3% of that value added. In contrast, the large farmer, the large, medium farmer gets about 30% of that surplus. Why? Because the small farmer does not have any bargaining power. He is beholden to go and sell it at the local mandi where the intermediary ends up extracting the surplus. If the small farmer has the option to say, मैं आपको नहीं बेचूंगा, मैं जाके किसी और को बेच सकता हूँ. If I have that option, আমি আপনাকে দেব না, আমার কাছে অপশন আছে, আমি গিয়ে আর কাউকে actually দিয়ে দেব. তো ওই অপশনটা যখন বলে, ওই অপশনটা actually যেরকম bargaining power দেয়, the bargaining power that it gives is actually very important for the small farmer, and that bargaining power comes from options.
Dr. Subramanian, I must confess, your Bengali has really surprised me. The name and the language don't go together, but I think is a wonderful answer. And I'm sure Vibhav Bhartiya, look at the tweet and look at the corresponding link. I'm sure you'll have more answers there. We did talk about manufacturing sector. You talked about services. Mr. Niyoti asked about services. We talked about labor reforms. This is a question which is coming from Anil Garg about the capital markets. And also Samarjit Ghosh asked in a similar line. He asked, the capital markets are booming despite dismal GDP data. The number of first-time investors are all on a high. How do you explain the market euphoria against a backdrop of shrinking economy?
So firstly, if you look at a stock price, what is a stock price? A stock price is a combination of the value of the existing assets of the firm and the value of all future growth opportunities of the firm. That's a big difference. GDP data is about the activity that happened today, while the stock price of a firm and therefore the index itself is also a reflection of the future, the cash flows that firms will generate in future. And so the market, partly at least, I'm not going to say fully, is reflecting some of the future growth opportunities that are going to come through the seminal reforms that are being done, number one. Number two, also, if you look at, it's not as if every firm is necessarily, is adversely impacted. In fact, COVID has thrown up significant opportunities for firms that are actually are better enabled digitally. And those firms that can actually utilize the opportunity from the movement towards digital economy, they will definitely benefit. And that is, some of those firms are in the service sector, some of those firms are in the technology sectors. In the US, for instance, if you look at Apple has basically now touched $3 trillion as its valuation has gone up. And partly that is because of the fact that the digital economy, and more tech-oriented economy will benefit these firms. So if you look at the Sensex itself, and this is something which we showed in the economic survey, chapter, if I remember right, chapter 3, pro-business versus pro-crony. If you go and check there that the composition of the Sensex is that there's a lot of IT sector, financial sector, which accounts for almost 50% of the Sensex. And many of these will benefit from the COVID exogenous shock, because now the shock has illustrated that we can actually have a conference like this, or a meeting like this, me sitting in Delhi, you all sitting in Calcutta. I can assure you that if I told this in February that I'll do it from sitting in Delhi, you would have all said, no way, it's not happening, it can't happen. And you know, it often requires a shock like this, and the fact that necessity is the mother of invention for some of these, you know, for some of these disruptions to happen. So I think the stock market is reflecting two fundamental things. One is the future growth opportunities, which is what the big difference between the GDP number and the, you know, and the stock market index. And second, it is also reflecting the fact that some of the tech sector, financial services, etc., will benefit from, you know, the disruption that is happening. Finally, there is also an element of some bit of possible overvaluation as well, only because of the, you know, the very liberal monetary policy that is being followed by central banks across the world. So there is a lot of money that is chasing returns, and, you know, given some of the reforms that we've done, investors are anticipating that, you know, that the economy will do very well, and that is, you know, chasing returns. If you think about it, actually globally, right, there aren't that many large economies that can promise a growth rate of 5.5%, 6% at least, you know, every year. If you take the United States, you take Europe, you take Japan, you know, none of these economies will be able to have a GDP growth, you know, anywhere exceeding 3%. It's going to be less than 3%. And I think the only other large economy that can sort of have this is China, and China is having its own set of, you know, issues now because of some of the policies that are being pursued. So India therefore becomes a natural outcome for, you know, or natural outlet for investors to look for the 5%, 6% growth, you know, top line growth, and that will basically lift, you know, as they say, a rising tide lifts all boats, and that is what is being reflected.
I think that was extremely lucid, and Anil and Samarjit, I guess your answer's been there. Just connecting the dots again, Dr. Subramanian, on the economic survey, and I quote against maybe one of your articles that the projection of GDP will grow at 6 to 6.5% in 2021, and you also had a eulogy of the T20 match, wherein in the initial first few overs, but nowadays you go bam bang right from the over one. And I connect that to another question which has come from Ram as well as from Shantanu. And Ram says that a very bleak picture has been painted of the Indian economy in the present COVID scenario. How do you think we are going to wriggle out of it? Or is our economy worse than other countries? Connecting another question which Shantanu asks is how is COVID on GDP, and then leading on to impact on infrastructure and supply chain? So all these a bit connected questions. Dr. Subramanian, if you could kind of throw your light on that.
Mr. Shinoy, I think I would say that the projection of GDP growth, I don't know where you're, you know, why you're sort of referring to that, in the sense that, you know, the entire world is affected by an unprecedented pandemic. There is going to be a global recession this year because of the pandemic. So the projections that were actually made not just by us but by everybody did not, you know, factor in the possibility of a pandemic that is a once in a century event. I think let's first acknowledge that. So all bets clearly are off on the, you know, on the projection there was for certainly not an economy that would be affected by the pandemic. So I think I would, you know, if I have to be brutally honest, I would say that was an unfair, you know, picking up of a particular quote. Now let me respond to the other parts. I think I've already, you know, communicated very clearly that the reforms that have been done in position the Indian economy really well for, you know, for the medium to long run, you know, and thereby the prospects are actually are very good. If you look at across the other economies, you know, among the large economies, if you look at even United States, for instance, you know, is the unemployment numbers actually are now higher than that during the Great Depression. So this is basically, you know, first in almost 90 years, 85, 90 years unemployment numbers, and they will also be facing bankruptcies. The Fed chairman just a couple of days back made this comment that there needs to be more, you know, support, fiscal support to ensure that bankruptcies don't happen. So I think every economy globally will get impacted. We, in my opinion, by doing the reforms, have actually really utilized this opportunity and positioned ourselves, well for emerging stronger out of this, unprecedented exogenous shock. As I've emphasized, we do need to, ensure that the short-term bridge is taken care of, so that the benefits of these reforms is completely avoided.
Thank you, Doc. And Ram and Shantanu, I think you've got your answers. And maybe a quick last couple of questions, if it is okay with you. You did mention about bottom of the pyramid, and we did have the Bandhan Bank CEO, Mr. Ghosh, sometime explaining us how in a branch he even keeps a number of chairs, plastic chairs, how many chairs need to be there. I'm just connecting that point with what the director of CMA asked, and he says, the recent report on World Bank on poverty and shared prosperity indicate the number of people in the world under extreme poverty would increase by about 15 crores. And the report expresses concern for India. Do you think we need to be a little worried about this, or how do you think we can come out of this better than the rest of the world?
So, I think globally, there is evidence that GDP growth rate is related definitely with poverty. High growth rates lift a lot of people out of poverty, and a year like this, when because of the pandemic and the uncertainty that it has created, the fact that the world economy will be in a recession is indeed going to have an impact on poverty. I think that is something that is inescapable. But I would think that by being able to bring growth back next year, and in fact possibly in the end of this year itself, I'm fingers crossed that we will have the vaccine by then, which will really help in that process. I think we will be able to reverse some of the trend that will manifest because of the impact on GDP growth because of the pandemic.
Thank you again, and I'm really sorry for any questions which have been coming thick and fast. Maybe I'll not be able to take all of them. Just one last question, and you did quote also that about the ethical wealth creation and the amount of effort. So, what are the steps which the government has taken to encourage people and companies for ethical wealth creation? This comes from Joy Chakravarti.
I think I've answered that my entire talk, and especially the thematic ribbon that I tied to all the reforms. Where about that? I think I've answered that question.
Okay, Joy. With that, I had many more, but Dr. Subramanian, I think we have just run out of time, and we thoroughly enjoyed your session. I think it's been the amount of questions which are coming in and amount of participation, I think has been one of the most widely participated sessions. But I'll leave as a proud Indian at the end of the session, and I'd like to quote from the Atmanirbhar Bharat, that one of the first things that we learn is in economics is actually there's nothing like a free lunch. We need to earn it. And self-reliance versus self-sufficiency. Self-reliance cannot come without capabilities, and competing with the best is what we need to aspire for, and that's what will get India to the next level. With that, Dr. Subramanian, thank you very much. I think it's been a pleasure having you here. And for all the listeners apologies for not taking in those questions. You can keep writing in, and I hope, Dr. Subramanian, we can hear from you in some other session shortly. Mr. Diotia, thank you again for being there, and always a support for CMA as usual. And everybody else, is Amitabh, you want to say something? Okay. And everybody else, thank you for joining in, and have a good night. Bye-bye.
Namaste.